I only needed somewhere to sleep. Then I found what someone had hidden beneath that trunk.
No room, no family, no key that still worked, just a torn canvas bag and $7 she had earned washing breakfast plates before dawn. And with that $7, she bought a forgotten steamer trunk maker's workshop outside Oshkosh in Winnebago County, Wisconsin, a place that had fallen off county maps in 1968. The north roof sagged between two split rafters. Rain had buckled half the maple floorboards. The county condemned it on October 3, 2022, with demolition planned for the first thaw of spring. But beneath the false bottom of a leather steamer trunk, sealed behind silk no hand had lifted in 87 years, something waited that would change the measure of her life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Hazel Mercer had been packing her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she learned to keep only what could be carried in one trip. Her father changed jobs whenever bills caught him, and each new apartment left behind another lamp, another chair, another box marked books in his square black handwriting. Hazel became skilled at folding a life small enough to fit beneath a bus seat. Her father, Daniel, repaired school boilers by day and read travel magazines at night, tracing ocean routes with a cracked thumbnail. He promised Hazel they would see Lake Superior from the Canadian side. They never did. He died before her 23rd birthday, leaving a narrow house, a modest account, and two daughters divided by silence. The one fixed place in Hazel's childhood belonged to her grandfather, Eli Mercer, Daniel's father, who repaired luggage in a shed behind his cottage near Lake Winnebago. Every Saturday, Hazel sat beside him at a bench scarred by awls and hot glue. Eli taught her to wet vegetable-tanned leather until it bent without cracking, to set a brass rivet against a steel dolly, and to strike once for placement, once for shape, once to finish. At noon, they ate rye bread and cheddar from waxed paper. Then he opened an old steamer trunk and showed her how its frame carried pressure into the corners. Before dusk, she stamped a small crescent into scrap hide and wrote the date beneath it. A good trunk does not keep the world out, Eli once told her. It keeps what matters steady while the world moves. Hazel understood years later that he had been speaking about people. Eli died in January 2017 after a brief winter illness. By the time Hazel returned from the hospital, his shed had been cleared. The awls, copper rivet tins, patterns, corner molds, and two unfinished trunks had gone to an estate buyer. Her father stood in the empty doorway with sawdust on his shoes and could not say who had authorized the sale. After Daniel's death, Hazel's half-sister Paige took control quietly. She answered calls before Hazel could reach the phone, arranged papers in neat blue folders, and spoke to bank clerks as though repeating instructions already settled. Paige never shouted. She lowered her voice instead, which made everyone else lean toward her. She brought Hazel forms to sign while Hazel was working double shifts and said they concerned taxes, utilities, and temporary probate access. Their stepmother, Marlene, sat beside the window polishing the same silver spoon for nearly an hour. On September 12, 2022, Hazel came home to find a new brass lock where her key had once turned. Her torn canvas bag stood on the porch, its zipper tied shut with kitchen string. Paige waited behind the storm door, one hand resting on the frame. Through the glass, Hazel could see her father's wool coat still hanging in the hall. "You signed it, Hazel. This house is mine." 8 words. Paige placed a photocopy against the glass showing Hazel's signature beneath a waiver of inheritance rights. The letters looked almost correct except the final R curved upward, a habit Hazel had lost in high school. She looked past Paige toward Marlene. The older woman held the silver spoon against her palm and did not lift her eyes. The silence closed the door more completely than the lock. Hazel carried the bag to the Oshkosh transit shelter and spent her first night upright beneath a route map. She had $6.32 after buying soup. During the next week, she slept in the Appleton bus station until security changed shifts, then beneath picnic tables at Menominee Park, where lake wind shook the metal roof. She walked south to Fond du Lac after a shelter turned her away past intake and slept behind a laundromat vent. 2 weeks later, in Neenah, she traded $1 for coffee and kept the cup because it held heat longer than her gloves. Her money fell to $3, then $1.75, then 94 cents. She learned which church vestibules opened before sunrise and which library bathrooms had outlets near the sink. She washed one shirt at a time beneath hand dryers until the sleeves smelled scorched. 6 weeks after the lock changed, Hazel sat in the Oshkosh Public Library with rain drying on her shoulders. She had $7 again, earned by stacking chairs after a church supper, and was searching classified notices for rooms when a crooked advertisement caught her eye. County disposal, it read. One former trunk workshop, structure as is, cash deed, $7. The photograph showed a low brick building beneath bare walnut trees, one chimney leaning against a white November sky. She copied the parcel number onto the back of a discarded checkout slip. The workshop was 9 miles west of town, beyond the last regular bus stop. $7 would leave her nothing. Hazel folded the notice into quarters, placed it in the inner pocket of her coat, and stood before caution could disguise itself as wisdom. By sunrise, she was walking toward a building the county had already decided should disappear. Hazel followed State Road 21 until the morning traffic thinned and the sidewalk surrendered to gravel shoulders. The county bus carried her as far as Omro for $1.25. From there, she walked 7 miles beneath a sky the color of unpolished tin, keeping the wind at her back whenever the road bent west. Her canvas bag rubbed one shoulder raw, near dusk when the temperature fell to 28 degrees. She climbed through a broken gate and slept in the hayloft of an unused dairy barn, buried to her chin in dry timothy that smelled of dust and summer rain. Mice worked beneath the boards. Frost formed along the nail heads above her. She reached the outskirts of Oshkosh again the following morning by a southern farm road, then turned toward the county offices with straw caught in her hair. The town was opening around her. Keller's bakery carried trays toward a fogged window. Bellin's shoe repair raised its striped awning. The Lake Street Cafe set out a chalkboard breakfast menu. Madsen Hardware rolled galvanized trash cans onto the pavement, and a clerk at Winnebago Pharmacy swept salt from the doorway with a red push broom. The Winnebago County Administration Building had limestone steps worn shallow in the center. Hazel climbed them slowly, aware of the dirt dried into the knees of her jeans. Inside, the air smelled of floor wax, paper, and the faint hot metal scent of radiators beginning their winter work. At the property counter sat a woman with a single white braid wound tightly at the back of her head. Her nameplate read Mrs. Eleanor Voss, deputy clerk. She wore a green cardigan buttoned to the throat and turned the classified notice over twice before looking at Hazel. You understand the structure is condemned? Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no electrical service? Yes, ma'am. No county water, no furnace, no septic certification? Yes, ma'am. And demolition may proceed if you fail inspection by spring. Hazel placed 7 folded dollar bills on the counter. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Voss did not touch the money at first. She studied Hazel's coat, the frayed canvas bag, and the purple half-moons beneath her fingernails. Then she removed a deed packet from a metal drawer and aligned its corners against the edge of her blotter. You will be accepting all liens associated with nuisance abatement, she said. Those are currently suspended, not erased. Hazel read every line. Paige had cured her of signing pages placed beneath a pointing finger. When she reached the final paragraph, she asked for a ruler, laid it beneath each sentence, and read the legal description again. Mrs. Voss watched without impatience. Hazel signed. The clerk lifted a brass county stamp with a dark walnut handle and pressed it into the ink pad. The seal landed with a heavy, exact sound, leaving the date and county crest in blue-black circles. Mrs. Voss counted the bills, placed them inside a narrow envelope, and gave Hazel the deed. County Road K West, she said. Turn north on Leonard Point Road, pass the drainage ditch, take the gravel lane with 2 stone posts. If you reach the old school foundation, you have gone too far. Her fingers stopped on the surname, Mercer. Hazel waited. Mrs. Voss opened a lower drawer and removed a card index bound with a cracked rubber band. She searched beneath M, moving each card with the edge of one thumbnail. Was Eli Mercer your relation? He was my grandfather. The braid at the back of Mrs. Voss's head seemed to loosen, though it did not move. "He came here in 1989 asking about that parcel," she said. "He wanted to know whether the workshop still held its original benches. The owner would not sell." Eli left a note in the file saying the place had belonged to a branch of his mother's family. Hazel looked down at the deed. The paper had felt thin when she signed it. Now it seemed to carry weight through both hands. "He never told me. People often wait too long to tell what they believe they have time to explain." Mrs. Voss returned the card to its place. Before closing the drawer, she removed Hazel's first dollar bill from the envelope and held it briefly beneath the desk lamp. "This one is older than the others," she said. It was a worn 1995 bill, softened from passing through many hands. Mrs. Voss slipped it beneath the glass top of her desk beside a pressed maple leaf and a photograph of a boy holding a fishing pole. "For the record," she said, "the county received payment." Hazel stepped back into the cold with the deed folded inside her coat beside the classified notice. She did not examine the feeling that moved through her when the clerk had spoken Eli's name. She simply began walking. Leonard Point Road ran between harvested fields and low wetlands bright with ice. At the first farmhouse, an elderly man splitting kindling paused with his maul raised. His brown dog came to the ditch, barked once, then sneezed. "You heading to the trunk place?" the man called. Hazel nodded. "Roof leaks, I was told." The man lowered the maul. "Dog's name is Walter, mine's Harlan." Hazel gave him her name and continued. Walter followed her to the property line before turning back. Beyond the next bend, bare walnut trees leaned over a lane almost erased by grass. The workshop appeared gradually between them. It was a brick structure roughly 24 feet wide and 40 feet long, built on a fieldstone foundation darkened by moss. The north wall bowed outward by perhaps 2 inches. Cedar shingles remained only in patches, exposing gray roof boards beneath. A square chimney rose from the rear half with 3 courses missing near the cap. Over the double doors hung a faded wooden sign. Most of its lettering had peeled away, but Mercer Travel Caseworks could still be read when the light struck sideways. Hazel stood beneath it without moving, then she fitted the county key into the padlock. The doors resisted until she put one shoulder against them. Something inside scraped backward. A narrow blade of daylight crossed the floor and caught hundreds of brass rivets scattered through the dust like dull seeds. The first breath of the room tasted bitter. Rancid cowhide, old hide glue, mouse nests, and wet brick had been sealed together for years. Hazel covered her mouth with her sleeve and pushed farther inside. Her boots pressed grit into warped maple boards. Somewhere in the rear wall, water tapped with patient regularity into a metal pan. The front room held a long cutting table beneath 3 windows. A roll of sailcloth had collapsed upon itself, its outer layers brown with mildew. Leather straps hung from ceiling hooks hard as bark. When Hazel touched one, it cracked and left a dry red powder on her fingers. A narrow doorway opened into the workroom. Here the cold seemed stored rather than passing through. She could hear wind entering around the chimney stones and feel it move across her ankles. A treadle sewing machine stood against one wall. Beside it rested a trunk frame large enough to serve as a child's bed, its pine ribs exposed, its curved lid unfinished. Hazel ran her palm over one maple slat. Beneath the dust, the wood remained smooth. Behind the workroom was a small office with a cast-iron stove, a wall cupboard, and enough clear floor for one person to lie down. She found a broom without half its bristles and swept mouse droppings into a square of newspaper. The work warmed her until sweat gathered beneath her coat, then chilled as soon as she stopped. Night arrived before she could secure every broken pane. She wedged canvas scraps into the worst gaps, spread her coat upon the office floor, and placed the deed inside her shirt so the paper would stay dry. For supper, she ate the last heel of bread from the church kitchen and drank water from a jar Harlan had filled when he saw her returning from the lane. In darkness, the building revealed its separate voices. Roof boards lifted and settled, a loose length of tin clicked near the eaves. The chimney breathed whenever the wind crossed its opening. From the main room came a faint metallic roll, then silence as one brass rivet found a lower place on the warped floor. Hazel lay awake with Eli's 3-stroke rhythm moving through her memory. Place, shape, finish. Sometimes we build wings for others, but when the chance comes, we must make a trunk of our own and leave. At first light, Hazel folded her coat, tucked the deed beneath a loose office drawer, and began learning what the workshop required before it would permit her to stay. The well stood 40 yards behind the building beneath a cap of weathered cedar. Its hand pump groaned but gave no water until she poured in the last cup from Harlan's jar to prime the leather seal. After 12 strokes, the pipe coughed rust, then released a cold, clear stream that numbed her fingers. The outhouse leaned toward the marsh and had no door latch, so she tied it shut from inside with a strip cut from her bag. By the third evening, she knew every voice in the floor. The long complaint near the cutting table, the sharp snap beside the stove, and the quiet board behind the unfinished trunk that did not creak at all. On the fourth morning, Hazel walked back toward town carrying a list written on the classified notice. Madsen Hardware occupied a narrow storefront with drawers rising to the press tin ceiling. The place smelled of paraffin, rope, iron filings, and coffee left too long on a warmer. A brass bell trembled above the door. The owner emerged from behind a rack of stovepipe elbows. He was a broad man in his late 60s with one eyebrow burned away and a carpenter's pencil tucked behind the opposite ear. "Jonas Madsen," he said. "You are the woman at Mercer Works." Hazel asked how he knew. "Mrs. Voss bought lamp oil yesterday. She never buys lamp oil." He read Hazel's list and made a small sound through his nose when he reached chimney brush. "I have $7.40 left," she said. "That will not clean a chimney and feed you." "I know." Jonas opened a ledger bound in black cloth and turned to a fresh page. "I can give you a 30-day account for materials only. You sign every purchase. No tobacco, no candy, no borrowing cash. I cannot promise payment in 30 days. Then promise an honest account." Hazel looked at the empty line beneath account name. "I can do that." He wrote Mercer Travel Caseworks across the top, then handed her a stained booklet titled Repairs for Farm and Workshop, printed in 1948. "My father kept 3 copies," he said. "This one has already survived worse owners." She left with a 16-foot chimney rod for $4.80, a 6-inch wire brush for $3.25, 2 pounds of stove cement for 90 cents, a box of Strike Anywhere matches for 19 cents, and a dented kettle marked down to $1.10. Jonas added a canvas dust sheet without entering it in the ledger. The chimney took most of the day. Hazel removed the stovepipe first, twisting it free over the dust sheet so the black flakes would not scatter across the office. She stuffed rags around the thimble, climbed to the roof by leaning an old orchard ladder against the south eave, and tied the brush to the first section of fiberglass rod. The cap had already fallen away. She fed the brush downward 1 length at a time, rotating clockwise so the threaded joints would not loosen. At 6 feet it stopped. She worked it upward 3 inches, then drove it down again with both hands. A clot of glazed creosote broke loose and struck the stove below like a handful of stones. For 4 hours, she scraped the flue in short turns, withdrawing the brush after each pass to knock away the black crust. Soot gathered beneath her nails and inside her sleeves. Twice, the wind pressed her flat against the shingles. When the rod finally reached the thimble, she could see a pale coin of daylight through the chimney's throat. Back inside, she shoveled nearly 2 buckets of creosote and mortar chips from the stove. She sealed a hairline crack in the collar with damp stove cement, waited until it skinned over, then built a test fire from newspaper, walnut twigs, and 3 dry boards split from a broken crate. The first flame bent toward the draft, smoke climbed cleanly. Hazel held both hands above the stove until feeling returned to her fingertips. She boiled well water in the dented kettle, stirred in oats Jonas had placed inside the manual, and ate her first hot meal in days from a chipped enamel cup. The room did not become warm, exactly, but the cold withdrew from the center. Afterward, she began a careful inventory of the workroom. The treadle machine still carried a spool of waxed linen thread. Beneath the cutting table lay a maple slat gauge notched in 1/4-inch intervals. A cast-iron corner press stood bolted to the floor, its dies shaped for rounded trunk caps. There were 2 cobbler's hammers, one with a split hickory handle, a leather skiving knife darkened by old sharpening oil, a box of brass escutcheon plates wrapped in newspaper dated March 1935, 6 pine trunk frames stacked against the wall, and the enormous leather-covered trunk Hazel had noticed on her first night. It stood nearly 5 feet long and 3 feet high, with blackened brass corners and 3 maple slats running over its domed lid. The leather had hardened to the color of burned coffee. Unlike the unfinished frames, it was complete. Hazel brushed dust from its lock plate. No key remained. She worked the latch pins loose with a narrow awl found beneath the bench, then lifted the lid by degrees. The hinges complained but held. Inside, faded burgundy silk covered the walls in a pattern of small gold leaves. The trunk smelled less of mildew than the room around it. Cedar, faint but certain, lingered beneath the leather. She pressed each panel with her fingertips. The sidewalls flexed evenly. The lid lining had been stitched without breaks. At the bottom, however, the silk gave a different answer. Hazel tapped near the left corner with the wooden handle of the skiving knife. Hollow, she tapped the center. Dense. The trunk was also too heavy. 2 people would have been needed to move it. Yet when Hazel tipped one end with a pry bar, the shell rose more readily than its weight suggested. Something substantial was spread across the base rather than resting loose inside. She removed the silk lining 1 tack at a time, sliding each brass tack into an enamel bowl so none would be lost. Beneath the fabric lay a thin pine panel fitted so exactly that its seam resembled a grain line. No finger knot showed. No screw head broke the surface. Hazel ran the slat gauge along all 4 edges. At the rear right corner it caught on a cedar disc no wider than a quarter, darkened to match the pine. She pressed it. Nothing. She turned it clockwise with the rubber end of her pencil. The disc sank 1/8 of an inch. Somewhere below, a spring released with a dry metallic click. The false bottom rose slightly along one edge. Hazel did not lift it at once. She swept the floor, fed another board into the stove, and washed her hands in the kettle water. Then she returned with the dust sheet, spread it beside the trunk, and raised the panel using both palms. Underneath were 4 long packages wrapped in oilcloth, a narrow tin box, and a leather journal secured by a green ribbon. The cavity had been lined with cedar veneer so thin it followed the shape of the trunk without changing its exterior dimensions. Hazel opened the packages in order from smallest to largest. The first held 3 saddler's awls with polished rosewood handles, a rivet setter, and Eli's crescent stamp. She knew the mark before she wiped it clean. The second contained brass combination locks nested in cotton, including 1 gold lock with 4 numbered wheels and an uncut shackle. The third held rolled hides of calf skin and Russian leather, stiff at the edges but protected by waxed paper. The last package contained a hand-forged draw knife, 2 corner molds, a small steel dolly, and a trunkmaker's hammer balanced so precisely that the head seemed to settle itself into her grip. She placed every tool on the dust sheet in the order she found it. Only then did she open the tin box. Inside were paper currency bundles, canvas coin rolls, and a blue velvet case. Hazel carried them to the office, closed both doors, and set the kettle on the stove, though she did not light another fire. She counted slowly. There were 5 bundles of $100 bills, mostly older series, each tied with cotton tape and labeled in pencil. Beneath them lay 20s and 10s folded flat between sheets of waxed paper. The coin rolls held Morgan silver dollars, peace dollars, Indian head cents, and worn buffalo nickels. 1 small packet contained foreign coins from France, Egypt, Hong Kong, and Argentina, though none showed enough wear to suggest that they had traveled in a pocket. Hazel counted once, wrote the total on the back of a hardware receipt, and counted again. $41,500, not a dollar more. The blue velvet case held a victory medal from the First World War with campaign clasps for Meuse-Argonne and defensive sector. A narrow paper tag had been tied through the ring. Thomas Mercer, 1919. Hazel laid the medal beside the crescent stamp. The same family name had passed through the county drawer, the faded sign, the clerk's memory, and now this small piece of bronze. The leather journal remained unopened, so did the folded letter beneath its ribbon. She carried the money back to the trunk, returned each bundle to the tin box, and lowered the false panel without engaging the spring. Then she took the journal, the medal, and the letter outside. Evening had flattened the marsh into strips of steel and pewter. Hazel walked beyond the well to where a drainage creek widened beneath thin ice. She sat on a limestone block with the letter resting against her knee. Muskrats moved somewhere beneath the bank. Farther out, dark water showed through a broken seam in the ice and reflected one star. She stayed there until the cold entered her boots. The letter could wait for daylight. Sometimes we build wings for others, but when the chance comes, we must make a trunk of our own and leave. Morning came clear and bitter. Hazel carried the letter to the cutting table, where winter light entered through the least broken pane. The paper had yellowed around the folds, but the handwriting remained dark and disciplined, each capital made with a square beginning stroke. She recognized it from the dates beneath Eli's leather scraps. Not his handwriting, the hand that had taught his hand. She untied the green ribbon. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then you have already learned more about this house than most people ever wish to know. You listened to the trunk instead of judging its leather. That is a beginning. My name is Ruth Ann Mercer. In May of 1935, Dr. Samuel Koenig at St. Agnes Hospital in Fond du Lac told me that the growth beneath my left breast had reached the bone. He spoke kindly and did not pretend that kindness could change the diagnosis. He believed I had one winter, perhaps two. I returned here and began putting the shop in order. Our work came through 4 generations. Amos Mercer, born in 1841 near Erie, Pennsylvania, learned case framing from German cabinet makers and came to Oshkosh in 1867. His daughter Lydia Mercer, born in 1868, cut linings and kept the accounts when women's names were not painted on shop signs. Lydia's son Thomas, born here in 1892, strengthened trunks for soldiers and railwaymen before leaving for France in 1918. I was Thomas's daughter, born in 1904, and I took the bench after my mother's hands failed. Your place in that line may be near or distant. Work does not always travel by the shortest blood road. Thomas returned from the Great War with a medal and a cough that never left him. My husband, Edward Vail, was lost aboard the USS Reuben James in October 1941. Our son had died of fever 3 years earlier. After Edward was gone, I kept this shop open alone until August 17, 1935. That was the exact day Mercer Travel Caseworks closed. No hammer has answered mine for more than 30 years as I write this. Silence changes a workshop. It does not erase instruction. Use white pine for a travel frame and let it season below 12% moisture before joining. Warm hide glue to 140 degrees, but never let it boil. For lining paste, mix 1 part wheat starch with 4 parts water and cook it until clear. When setting brass rivets, leave 1/16 inch above the washer, then strike 3 times, first to seat, second to spread, third to finish. Leather bends best after 12 minutes beneath a damp cloth. Longer makes the grain weak. The money beneath the floor was earned slowly. Some came from repair work. Some came from trunks ordered by people who crossed oceans while I remained here measuring their corners. I kept foreign coins from places I studied but never saw. I once believed saving them was the same as waiting for permission. It was not. An inheritance is not the money another person leaves. It is the work they trusted someone else to continue honestly. Use what you need to make the roof sound, the chimney safe, and your hands capable. Keep the rest until you understand whether it belongs to you or to someone not yet born. Behind the workshop, the 3rd walnut tree carries our crescent mark on its north side. Beneath that tree is another matter, but it should not be opened merely because it can be. There is also a brass railway lamp hanging behind the back door. Thomas carried it home from France. Light it once for those who built departures for other people and never found a road of their own. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Ruth Ann Mercer, November 2, 1935. Hazel read the letter twice. The first time, she held it carefully at the edges. The second time, her thumb rested over Ruth's signature until the warmth of her skin softened the old paper. When she finished, she folded each page along its original creases, neither adding a new line nor pressing the old ones flat. She carried the letter through the workroom and opened the back door. Frost whitened the grass beyond the well. The walnut trees stood in a crooked row beside the drainage creek, their bark deeply ridged and nearly black where the sun had not reached. Hazel counted from the workshop. The third tree leaned slightly east. On its north side, beneath a shelf of dead moss, a crescent had been cut into the bark. Time had widened the mark until it resembled a small moon seen through water. Hazel touched it with 2 fingers but did not search the soil. Ruth had written that another matter waited there. Waiting did not mean asking. Behind the back door hung a brass railway lamp under a gray cloth. Its glass chimney remained whole, and a tablespoon of kerosene darkened the bottom of the reservoir. Hazel trimmed the wick with Eli's skiving knife, filled the cup from Mrs. Voss's lamp oil, and struck 1 match against the box from Jonas Madsen. The flame rose blue, then settled into amber. She placed the lamp on the cutting table beside the metal and crescent stamp. Its light reached only part way across the room, but it found the brass rivets in the floor, one after another. Hazel considered how little had carried her to that table. Eleanor Voss had kept 1 worn dollar and given a family name back to her. Harlan had filled a jar without asking for an explanation. Jonas had opened a credit ledger when she could offer no reliable date of payment. None of them had changed her life with a grand act. Each had simply refused to make a difficult hour harder. There may be someone watching who remembers such an hour, who gave you one small kindness when you had no way to repay it. A meal, a ride, a dry coat, a door left open. Tell us about that person in the comments. Some gifts deserve to be spoken aloud even years later. That night, Hazel placed Ruth's letter, Thomas's medal, the crescent stamp, and the trunk maker's hammer beside her folded coat. The brass lamp burned low upon the stove. She slept with one hand resting near the tools as though guarding them and being guarded in return. The first snow arrived on December 3rd and measured 6 inches against the north foundation by noon. Hazel stood beneath the leaking rafters with Ruth's letter folded inside her shirt and read the roofing chapter in Jonas Madsen's repair manual 3 times before climbing the ladder. The roof measured 26 by 42 feet once she allowed for the overhang. She calculated 34 bundles of cedar shingles, 3 rolls of roofing felt, and 22 pounds of hot-dipped nails, then checked the figures against the margins of the manual. Jonas extended the account without comment. When she came for the final boxes, he placed a narrow roofing hatchet on the counter. Its leather grip was dark with use. "My brother carried that 30 years, he said. A former roofer named Walter Brunn came after hearing Hazel had begun a loan. He was 73, with white mortar caught permanently in the lines of his knuckles. He refused money, climbed to the ridge, and showed her where to sister a split rafter with a full-length pine board, bolts staggered so the old wood would not tear along one line. They worked 11 days. Walter snapped a chalk line across each course while Hazel set shingles with an 1/8-inch gap and kept every joint offset from the one below. He taught her the 3-stroke nail technique. The first stroke placed the nail, the second drove it nearly flush, and the third seated it without bruising the cedar. "That nail's proud." Hazel checked the head. "Pull it." By mid-December, the last ridge cap lay straight beneath a pale sky. Snow remained in the walnut shadows, but no water entered when sleet came that night. Hazel set a dry enamel basin beneath the former leak and left it there until morning. It held nothing. In January, the chimney began shedding brick dust onto the stove. The upper courses had spalled from years of trapped moisture, and powdered mortar sifted from the joints whenever the wind pressed against the stack. Hazel lowered each damaged brick in a bucket rather than dropping it, cleaned the beds with a plugging chisel, and mixed hydraulic lime with washed sand in a ratio of 1 to 2. Around the flue tile, she added fire clay to the mortar, 1 part fire clay to 3 parts lime mixture, working only enough for half an hour before it stiffened. For 3 weeks, the temperature rarely rose above 28 degrees. Hazel warmed the bricks beside the stove. The stove carried them upward 4 at a time and wrapped each new course with canvas at dusk. Her bare hands went numb every 15 minutes because gloves dulled her sense of the joints. She climbed down, held her fingers over the stove until they stung, then returned to the roof. On January 27th, she waited until the new crown had cured, opened the damper, and laid a test fire no larger than her palm. The smoke entered the flue without hesitation. Outside, it rose from the rebuilt chimney in a straight gray thread, then bent east above the frozen marsh. Late January brought the floors. The white pine planks were sound beneath the grime, fastened with hand-cut rosehead nails whose black heads stood unevenly where the boards had shrunk. Hazel drove each nail below the surface with a narrow punch before renting a random orbit sander from Jonas for $14 a day. The first pass, at 80 grit, lifted wax, glue, and the gray skin of neglect. The second, at 120, softened the scars without erasing them. She finished at 220, guiding the machine with the grain and stopping often enough to empty the dust bag before it clogged. For 3 evenings, she rubbed oil into the boards with folded linen, one thin coat at a time. Each coat rested until the surface no longer felt tacky. After the third, she shut the rooms and allowed a 48-hour cure. The floor changed from dark honey toward mahogany, though no stain had touched it. Old nail holes appeared as black constellations. Near the cutting table, a curved groove remained where generations of boots had turned around the bench. One morning, Hazel woke before dawn and could not make herself lift the sander. She walked to the marsh instead. A great blue heron stood in open water between plates of ice, its neck folded and one leg hidden. For nearly an hour, neither of them moved. Hazel did no work that day. She boiled coffee, sharpened Eli's crescent stamp, and allowed the rooms to remain quiet. February belonged to the windows. There were 8 in all. 3 had no glass, 4 were cracked, and 1 retained an original pane dated by a scratched corner mark from 1788. The old glass bowed slightly and held tiny seeds of air inside it. Hazel left that pane untouched, cleaning it only with warm water and a square of soft cotton. For the others, she removed the brittle putty with a glazing chisel held nearly flat so the wooden rabbets would not split. She brushed boiled linseed oil into the dry sash, pressed new panes against glazing points, then rolled DA33 putty between her palms until it softened. Each bevel was drawn in one steady pass, the knife angled to shed water beyond the glass. 2 upper sashes had lost their cords. Hazel threaded quarter-inch cotton sash cord over the pulley, tied a figure-8 knot through each iron counterweight, and lowered the weights slowly into their pockets. The knots held without slipping. When the repaired sash rose beneath one hand and stayed at shoulder height, she raised and lowered it 3 more times simply to feel the balance. On the final window, she was trimming a thin line of putty from the lower rail when a chickadee landed on the nearest walnut branch. The bird turned its black-capped head toward the glass. Small claws closed around the wet bark and watched Hazel complete the last corner. She set down the knife. Outside, the chickadee gave one clear note and flew toward the creek. By late February, the walls had begun to shed their own history. Horsehair plaster clung to hand-split oak lath in broad islands, but 3 patches near the chimney failed within a week. The first cracked overnight. The second sagged away from the lath. The third remained until Hazel touched its edge, then fell intact into her hands like a broken plate. Jonas gave her an old feed bag filled with clean horsehair saved from his father's shop. Hazel soaked the fibers, teased them apart, and mixed them into lime plaster until each handful held together without becoming ropey. She pressed a scored scratch coat between the oak strips, laid a 3/8-inch brown coat over it, and waited the full 72 hours before returning. The finish coat went on 1/8 inch thick, smoothed with a damp steel trowel until the wall caught light without shining. Standing near the repaired chimney, she pressed her palm against the cool surface. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Clem, who owned the Lake Street Cafe, began leaving paper bags on the workshop doorstep every Tuesday and Friday. Doris had a silver streak in her black hair and wore one red earring because she had lost the other 20 years before. The bags held bread ends, apples bruised on one side, soup in jars, and once a small wedge of cherry pie wrapped in waxed paper. Hazel carried money to the cafe after her first paid repair. Doris pushed it back across the counter with 2 floury fingers. In Candles, when the shop reopened, Caleb Madsen arrived one Saturday on a blue Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, narrow as a fence rail, with a pale scar cutting through his left eyebrow. Without asking permission, he split the walnut rounds Harlan had left near the woodshed and stacked them bark side up beneath the eaves. Hazel offered him $2. Caleb shook his head and looked toward the faded sign. My mother said, "About your grandfather." He did not explain further. Before leaving, he sharpened the maul on a flat stone and leaned it beside the back door. Or, Reverend Boyd walked Leonard Point Road each morning at 7:10 regardless of weather. He wore a black felt hat with a brim polished by rain and carried no umbrella. Whenever Hazel was outside, he tipped the hat, placed 2 fingers briefly against the workshop gate, and said the same 4-word prayer. Keep this work honest. He never crossed the threshold unless invited. Hazel postponed the cellar until February 11th. The entrance lay beneath a trap door behind the office stove. 7 granite steps descended to a room 12 feet by 15. Its floor made of fitted fieldstone dark with old damp. She carried Thomas's railway lamp in one hand and tested each tread with the other before placing her full weight. At the center of the cellar rested a dressed granite slab marked with the crescent used on Eli's stamp. The edges were too exact for foundation work. Hazel brushed away grit, traced the carving, and left the slab where it was. Ruth had warned against opening a thing merely because it could be opened. Under the 3rd step, her lamp showed a line of oak where stone should have been. A small box had been wedged tightly behind the riser. Hazel eased it free with the skiving knife. Inside lay a brass key wrapped in faded blue wool. Its bow had been shaped like a domed steamer trunk, complete with 3 tiny slats across the lid. Beneath it was a tintype dated 1903. A young woman stood outside the workshop before the walnut trees had grown thick. She held a trunkmaker's hammer at her side. Her eyes, the set of her mouth, and the slight unevenness of her shoulders looked so much like Hazel that she turned the plate toward the lamp and then away. On the back, scratched into the metal, were the words, "Lydia Mercer, daughter of Amos, age 25, summer of 1903. Hazel carried the key upstairs and placed it on the mantel beside Thomas's lamp. She tried it in the desk, the trunk locks, the cupboards, and the office door. It fit none of them. There it remained. March loosened the snow from the south wall first. By April, the creak ran loud enough to be heard from the cutting table, and green walnut catkins hung above the lane like narrow tassels. Hazel opened every repaired window and let the building release the smell of winter smoke. She decided not to begin a full trunk that spring. Ruth's instructions deserved more than courage. Hazel spent 1 foreign coin on scrap leather, thin pine, brass tacks, and a cup of hide glue granules. She practiced corners no larger than her palm, cutting, wetting, folding, and discarding each failure without hiding it. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Hazel completed her first steamer trunk. It was 36 inches long, framed in seasoned white pine, and covered in dark green sailcloth brushed with wheat starch paste. 3 maple slats crossed the domed lid. Hazel set 148 brass rivets, each left 1/16 inch proud before the final 3 strokes. She lined the interior with plain burgundy cotton instead of silk and fitted the gold combination lock from Ruth's cache to the center plate. When the lid closed, the sound was deep and even. Hazel waited, opened it, and closed it again. The workshop around her had become sound without becoming new. The white pine floors held their mahogany depth. The repaired plaster showed faint trowel marks in winter light. Thomas's lamp hung beside the back door. The treadle machine faced the windows, and Eli's crescent stamp rested near her dominant hand. No object had been arranged merely for display. Everything waited to be used. The brass key remained on the mantel until a January wind split a dead limb from the 3rd walnut tree. Hazel went outside with a pruning saw and found a narrow iron plate exposed where the limb had torn away. It had been set flush into the trunk decades earlier, then swallowed by bark. At its center was a keyhole shaped like the opening beneath a steamer trunk lock. The brass key turned once. A shallow compartment released from the wood. Inside, protected by an oilskin envelope, lay a folded 48-star American flag and a note written by Lydia Mercer in April 1918, while Thomas served in France. Lydia wrote that she had placed the flag there because her son had gone to war carrying a trunk she had built, and she could not bear to keep it inside the house where every fold looked like waiting. She asked that it be returned to daylight only after someone had again taken up the family hammer. The note contained no prophecy. Lydia did not claim the shop would survive. She wrote only that honest work sometimes disappeared beneath bark and weather, yet remained honest. Hazel refolded the flag along its old lines and placed it beside Thomas's victory medal. On November 11, 2025, she carried both to Riverside Cemetery in Oshkosh. Thomas Mercer's marker stood beneath a sugar maple whose leaves had already fallen. Hazel cleaned the stone with water and a soft brush, laid the medal at its base for the length of the armistice observance, and held the flag against her coat while the courthouse bell marked 11. No crowd gathered. Reverend Boyd stood several rows away with his hat in both hands. The money remained mostly where Ruth had placed it. Hazel used $1 Morgan to purchase the leather and sailcloth for her first trunk. A second paid for replacement dies for the corner press. A peace dollar went to Jonas for the roofing hatchet, though he protested until she wrote the payment into his own ledger. She spent 1 Indian head cent on the first printed repair cards and another on a brass plaque for Thomas's lamp. The remaining coins and currency returned to the tin box. Hazel wrapped it in fresh oilcloth, placed Ruth's journal and a copy of every repair account beside it, and restored the false bottom. On the inner surface of the pine panel, she wrote in pencil, "For the next one, take only what the work requires." The shop did not reopen with an announcement. Doris pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard between a notice for piano lessons and a handbill for firewood. Mercer travel case, work trunk, and luggage repair leave. Name and number 3 people called that week. One brought a cracked college footlocker. Another carried a leather suitcase whose handle had belonged to her mother. A widower asked Hazel to reline a trunk so his grandchildren could store family quilts without snagging them. By spring, more than 40 names filled a mailing list kept in the same blue ledger Jonas had opened for her. Hazel accepted only the work she could finish carefully. Some weeks she repaired 2 pieces. Some weeks she repaired none. Caleb returned in June carrying a cedar sign wrapped in an old blanket. He had grown taller and now wore his grandfather's carpenter pencil behind one ear. The sign copied the faded lettering above the doors, Mercer Travel Case Works below it. Caleb had carved 2 smaller words. Daughters. Hazel ran her thumb through the fresh-cut letters. "There were daughters before me," she said. "I know." He turned the sign over. On the back, he had carved Lydia's name, Ruth's name, and Hazel's, leaving a blank line beneath them. Hazel did not ask whose name he expected there. They mounted the sign together above the repaired doors. Caleb held the ladder while Hazel drove square-cut nails through pre-drilled holes. The cedar darkened during the first rain and the letters remained clear. That autumn, Hazel began a letter of her own. She used Ruth's cutting table and a fountain pen Mrs. Voss had given her when the county formally withdrew the demolition order. She dated the page, paused over the opening, and then wrote, "My dear one, whoever you are." She described the roof calculation, the chimney mixture, the failed plaster, the 8 windows, and the exact sound made by a properly seated rivet. She recorded Jonas's credit account, Doris's paper bags, Caleb's maul, and Reverend Boyd's forward prayer. She did not write about Paige. Some doors needed no further naming. Hazel explained that the money had not saved her. The deed had not saved her either. What changed her life was the chance to answer one damaged thing at a time, and to become reliable in the answering. She left room at the bottom for instructions not yet learned. Sometimes we build wings for others, but when the chance comes, we must make a trunk of our own and leave. At dusk, Hazel closed the completed green trunk and carried it to the front window. Snow had begun again beyond the walnut trees. The new sign moved slightly above the doors, and warm lamplight crossed the repaired floor toward it. A steamer trunk maker's workshop waits. It has always waited. In the county clerk's office, Eleanor Voss retired with little ceremony. Before clearing her desk, she lifted the glass top and removed the pressed maple leaf and the photograph of the boy with the fishing pole. She left one thing behind. The worn dollar bill Hazel had placed on the counter remained beneath the glass beside a handwritten note for the next deputy clerk. Payment received in full.